A millionaire caught the caregiver protecting his disabled mother from his own wife. When she threatened to fire the response she heard left the millionaire stunned. The Montero mansion shone under the golden light of the crystal chandelier that dominated the dining room, where Alba observed her family gathered for yet another meal that had become a routine empty of genuine affection. Her 72 years weighed less on her shoulders than the icy silence that hovered between the French porcelain plates and the silver cutlery that clinked softly against the china. Alba adjusted the linen napkin on her lap, with hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from a strange sensation that was beginning to form at the base of her skull, an uncomfortable pressure that pulsed in an irregular rhythm. Ricardo, her only son, checked messages on his cell phone while cutting his steak without even looking at the plate, his blue eyes fixed on the illuminated screen that reflected in his Italian-framed glasses. Across the table, Alicia, her 38-year-old daughter-in-law, kept her phone pressed against her ear while gesturing with her free hand, her melodious voice floating through the room as she discussed details of a charity event with her friends from the club. "Mother, I need to leave for the airport in 15 minutes, Ricardo said without raising his eyes from the device. Alba tried to respond that she wasn't feeling well, but when she opened her mouth the words came out strange and slurred, as if her tongue had forgotten the movements necessary to form the correct sounds. The pain in her head suddenly intensified, transforming into a sharp stab that made her eyes water, and she brought her hand to her right temple, pressing hard in an attempt to relieve the growing pressure. Ricardo finally looked up, but only to check his wristwatch, an expensive gift that Alba had given him on his last birthday, without noticing his mother's obvious discomfort. Alicia continued her animated conversation, laughing at something someone had said on the other end of the line, her perfectly aligned blonde hair swaying gently as she tilted her head back. Alba tried again to communicate her discomfort, but this time the words didn't even come out. They remained trapped in her throat as if an invisible hand was suffocating them before they could escape. Her heart began to race, panic mixing with the growing pain that now spread throughout the right side of her head. "Need help," she finally managed to mutter, but her voice was muffled by the sound of Ricardo's chair being pushed back. Her son stood up hurriedly, adjusting his silk tie as he walked toward the door, his mind already focused on the important meeting he would have in the next few hours. Alba extended her hand in his direction, a desperate gesture that he didn't see, as he already had his back turned, checking if he had all the necessary documents in his leather briefcase. The dizziness that had begun mildly was now spinning the environment around her, making the chandelier above seem like a giant wheel of light that spun endlessly, and she clutched the edge of the table to try to stabilize herself. Alicia raised a finger asking for silence when Alba tried to get her attention, indicating that the phone conversation was too important to be interrupted, a gesture of disdain that she practiced frequently. The matriarch felt hot tears running down her cheeks, not just from the physical pain that was now almost unbearable, but from the devastating loneliness of being surrounded by people she should be able to count on and who didn't notice her suffering. Ricardo passed by her, distractedly kissing the top of her head, a mechanical gesture repeated thousands of times over the years. "Take good care of her, Alicia," he said over his shoulder as he picked up the car keys. The front door closed with a definitive sound that echoed through the mansion, and Alba realized with terrifying clarity that she was alone in her suffering, even with Alicia sitting less than 2 meters away. Her daughter-in-law gestured dramatically while talking on the phone, completely absorbed in her futile conversation, her red-painted lips moving quickly as she discussed table decorations for the event. Alba tried to stand up, her legs trembling under the weight of her own body that seemed to have tripled in the last few minutes, and managed to get to her feet by leaning heavily on the table. The sudden movement knocked over the crystal glass full of water, which shattered on the marble floor with a crash that should have caught anyone's attention, but Alicia merely frowned irritably and turned her back, moving away from the shards with obvious annoyance. Alba's vision began to darken at the edges, as if someone was slowly closing black curtains around her field of vision, and she knew she needed to reach the telephone in the hallway to call for help. Each step was a monumental battle against her own body that refused to obey her commands, her feet dragging across the polished floor. "Please help me," she whispered. But Alicia had already gone upstairs, still chatting animatedly. The hallway stretched before her like an endless tunnel, the walls covered with family portraits that seemed to observe her with faces distorted by her compromised vision. Alba leaned against the wall, leaving a trail of sweat on its impeccable surface as she dragged herself toward the telephone that sat on the antique sideboard, a family relic that had always been there. Her hands were shaking violently now, and she knocked over a Chinese porcelain vase that shattered on the floor, the fragments spreading like fallen stars across the dark marble. The sound should have alerted anyone, but the house remained wrapped in its indifferent silence, broken only by Alicia's distant voice upstairs, still on the phone, now laughing loudly at some joke. Alba was just a few steps from the telephone when her right knee gave out completely, causing her to dangerously stagger to the side. She extended her arm in a desperate attempt to reach the device, but her fingers merely brushed the receiver before her body finally betrayed her completely. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion, each second stretching into a cruel eternity as the floor rose to meet her. "Ricardo, my son, forgive me," she thought before the impact. The cold marble pressed against her cheek as Alba lay motionless in the hallway, her breathing becoming increasingly shallow and irregular. She could hear the tick-tock of the wall clock, each second marking the precious time that was draining away as she waited for help that wasn't coming. 20 minutes passed like 20 hours, her body beginning to go numb on the right side, the tingling sensation spreading from her shoulder to her fingertips. Upstairs, Alicia had changed clothes and was now talking to another friend, her crystalline laughter descending the stairs like a cruel melody that contrasted with the silent suffering on the floor below. Alba tried to scream, but only a weak moan escaped her lips, insufficient to cross the distance that separated her from any help. Her eyes fixed on a photo on the wall, an image of her holding baby Ricardo, both smiling in a time when the love between them was simple and pure. Darkness began to envelop her consciousness like a heavy blanket, and she fought against it with every fiber of her being, instinctively knowing that if she yielded now, she might never wake up again. "I cannot die like this, not here, not alone," she murmured into the void. It was the maid who finally found her, coming down to prepare the afternoon tea as she had done every day for 15 years. The scream that escaped her throat upon seeing Alba fallen was so high-pitched and desperate that it traveled through all floors of the mansion, making Alicia roll her eyes in irritation before descending the stairs. The transformation in the daughter-in-law was purely theatrical, her face assuming a mask of concern upon seeing her mother-in-law unconscious on the floor, although her eyes remained cold and calculating. Alicia approached slowly, more concerned with not soiling her new dress than with Alba's condition, and briefly touched the elderly woman's neck with her fingertips as if the contact was repugnant. The maid was crying desperately, holding Alba's hand and begging Alicia to call for help immediately, but the daughter-in-law took a few precious seconds observing the scene, as if calculating the implications. With deliberately slow movements, she picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number, her voice assuming a dramatic tone of panic that didn't match the bored expression on her face. Between urgent words to the operator, she cast irritated glances at the maid who was sobbing loudly. "Yes, my mother-in-law fell. I think it might be serious," she said with false concern while examining her nails. The wait for the ambulance transformed into a prolonged torture that tested even Alicia's feigned patience, as she alternated between checking messages on her cell phone and dramatically sighing about the delay. The traffic at that hour was a nightmare known to everyone. The main avenues transformed into open-air parking lots where cars barely moved, creating an impenetrable labyrinth even for emergency vehicles. 15 minutes passed, then 20, and Alicia began to pace back and forth, not out of concern for Alba, but because she had an appointment at the beauty salon that was running late. The maid remained kneeling beside Alba, murmuring prayers and gently stroking her employer's grey hair, while Alicia complained loudly about the incompetence of the healthcare system. She tried to call Ricardo, more to transfer responsibility than out of any genuine need to inform him, but his phone was already turned off, probably in airplane mode. 30 minutes had passed, when finally the distant sound of sirens began to approach, still struggling against the sea of vehicles that reluctantly made way. "Finally, I was already thinking about cancelling and calling a taxi," Alicia muttered quietly enough that only she herself could hear. The paramedics rushed in through the door with their equipment, two experienced men who immediately recognized the severity of the situation from the time elapsed and Alba's appearance. Alicia stepped back, letting them work while she answered their questions with deliberate vagueness about the time when Alba had fallen, not wanting to admit that she had no idea how long her mother-in-law had been abandoned on the floor. One of the paramedics began administering oxygen, while the other checked her vital signs, their faces becoming increasingly serious as the numbers on the portable monitors revealed the extent of the problem. Alba was unresponsive to any stimulation, her body completely limp as they carefully transferred her to the stretcher, and the paramedics exchanged worried glances that did not go unnoticed by the maid, who started crying again. Alicia observed everything with calculated detachment, already mentally reorganizing her day's schedule and thinking about how she would explain her delay at the salon while the paramedics prepared Alba for transport. The rush to the ambulance was quick and efficient, but the real challenge would be navigating the congested streets to the hospital. "Are you coming with us, Mum?" asked one of the paramedics, and Alicia visibly hesitated before agreeing with a resigned sigh. Inside the ambulance, the cramped space amplified every sound of the medical equipment and the frantic attempts to stabilize Alba as the vehicle lurched through traffic. Alicia sat as far away as possible, holding the handrail with one hand while typing messages with the other, cancelling her appointments for the day with elaborate excuses about the family emergency. The paramedic caring for Alba worked tirelessly, administering medications through an intravenous line and constantly adjusting the parameters of the portable respirator, his tense face revealing the struggle to keep the elderly woman alive. The sirens screamed their urgency, but the sound seemed only to irritate the surrounding drivers, who were reluctant to make way, some even honking back as if the ambulance were just another inconvenience in their already complicated day. 40 minutes passed on that journey that would normally take 15, each second potentially meaning irreversible damage to Alba's brain. Deprived of adequate oxygen for too long, Alicia looked at her watch once more, mentally calculating if she could still at least get her nails done after leaving Alba at the hospital. "How much longer?" she asked, with barely disguised impatience. The paramedic gave her a disapproving look before turning his attention back to Alba, whose vital signs remained unstable despite all efforts. The ambulance driver struggled to find gaps in the traffic, sometimes mounting the sidewalk or crossing red lights with extreme caution, but even so, progress was painfully slow. Alicia rolled her eyes when the vehicle had to stop completely for a few minutes, blocked by a minor accident that had happened ahead, and she muttered something about the general incompetence of people. The paramedic continued working in silence, but his expression said everything about what he thought of the daughter-in-law's attitude, who seemed more concerned with her cell phone than with her mother-in-law dying beside her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the hospital came into view, its emergency entrance already prepared with a medical team waiting. Alba was quickly transferred from the ambulance to the hospital, leaving Alicia behind pretending to be too shaken to accompany her immediately. "I need a moment to compose myself," she said dramatically to a passing nurse. The emergency waiting room was a depressing place with its beige walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs, filled with other people in various states of worry and despair. Alicia chose a chair in the furthest corner, away from a crying child and a man who was constantly coughing, and immediately began browsing her social media to pass the time. She posted a vague message about going through a difficult time with her family, quickly collecting dozens of supportive comments from her superficial friends who had no idea what was happening. An hour passed without any news, and Alicia began to get genuinely irritated by the delay, not out of concern for Alba, but because she was starving and the hospital didn't have anything decent in the cafeteria. She tried calling Ricardo again, leaving a voice message where her voice took on a completely fabricated, tearful tone, saying that her mother was very ill and that she was doing everything she could. Between one message and another, she searched online about how long it would take for Alba to recover from a stroke, already calculating how much this would interfere with her travel plans to Miami next month. If she ends up vegetating for months, Ricardo will have to hire someone, she thought with irritation. Other families in the waiting room observed Alicia with growing curiosity, noting the glaring discrepancy between her designer clothes and flashy jewelry, and her apparent lack of real anguish for the emergency that had brought her there. A middle-aged man, holding the hand of a pale child with an IV in his arm, cast disapproving glances as Alicia chuckled quietly at something on her phone, completely oblivious to the suffering around her. A young woman with eyes red from crying while waiting for news of her injured husband shook her head in disbelief, seeing Alicia check her makeup in a golden compact mirror, touching up her red lipstick as if she were about to leave for a cocktail party. Across the room, an elderly couple embracing each other, waiting for news of their grandson, whispered between themselves about the coldness of that elegant woman who seemed to be more in a beauty salon than in a hospital emergency. The discrepancy between the real drama experienced by everyone there and Alicia's barely disguised indifference created a palpable tension in the environment, as if her presence was an affront to the genuine suffering of others. "Some people have no heart," muttered a lady to her daughter, loud enough for Alicia to hear, although she pretended not to notice. An elderly lady beside her, with carefully combed white hair and a rosary in her trembling hands, tried to offer words of comfort, gently touching Alicia's arm with fragile fingers marked by time. The woman spoke about how she had gone through the same situation with her husband 2 years ago, how faith had helped her overcome difficult moments, and how the doctors at that hospital were excellent and would do everything possible to save her relative. Alicia just nodded distractedly, her eyes never leaving the phone screen where she was frantically typing a response about the floral decoration for a charity event next weekend, debating between white orchids or pink lilies. The elderly lady, realizing that her words were falling on deaf ears, sighed deeply and turned to her own prayers, quietly murmuring requests for mercy for all who suffered in that place. Alicia didn't even notice when the woman moved away to sit in another chair, away from her, as if her indifference was contagious. On her phone, her club friends responded with emojis and suggestions about the event, completely unaware of the drama she pretended to be experiencing. "Orchids are more elegant, darling," one of them typed, and Alicia smiled with satisfaction. The clock on the wall marked each minute with cruel precision, its monotonous tick-tock creating a hypnotic soundtrack for the anguishing weight that took over the room. Alicia looked at the display for the 10th time in 5 minutes, not out of concern for Alba, but calculating how much longer she would have to stay there before being able to leave without seeming completely insensitive. 2 hours had already passed since she arrived, and she began to drum her perfectly manicured nails on the armrest, an irritating sound that made several people cast disapproving glances at her. Even Alicia, in all her calculated coldness, began to wonder why it was taking so long, although her concern was purely practical about having to explain to Ricardo why it took her so long to realize his mother was ill. She could imagine his questions, the accusation in his eyes, and this irritated her deeply because it would mean having to play the role of the remorseful wife for days, perhaps weeks. The worst would be if Alba survived but became disabled, requiring constant care that would inevitably disrupt her carefully cultivated lifestyle. Why didn't we hire a full-time nurse before? She wondered with irritation. She mentally rehearsed her story like an actress preparing for a big scene, adjusting every detail to minimize her guilt and maximize her role as the dedicated daughter-in-law who did absolutely everything she could under the circumstances. First, she would say that Alba seemed perfectly fine during dinner, perhaps even more animated than usual, so that no one could accuse her of ignoring obvious signs. Then she would explain that she went upstairs for just a few minutes to change clothes because she had spilled something on her dress, a small but important detail that would justify her absence. The time Alba spent lying on the floor would be minimized to perhaps 5 or 10 minutes at most, and she would emphasize how quickly she acted once she discovered her mother-in-law, how she kept calm despite the panic, how she held Alba's hand in the ambulance, whispering words of encouragement. She even considered adding some strategic tears when telling the story to Ricardo, perhaps mentioning how she prayed the entire time, even though the last time she had set foot in a church was at her own wedding. The story was becoming so elaborate in her mind that she almost began to believe it herself. "Yes, that's exactly how it happened," she murmured to herself, satisfied with her edited version of events. A movement at the double doors of the emergency room caught her attention, and she saw a figure in a white coat emerge from the corridor that led to the treatment rooms. For a moment, Alicia continued browsing on her cell phone, responding to yet another message about her planned vacation to Miami, but then she realized the doctor was looking directly at her. With the agility of a veteran actress, she quickly put her cell phone in her designer bag and assumed an appropriate expression of concern, furrowing her brow and slightly biting her lower lip as she had seen protagonists do in soap operas. She stood up with a theatrical urgency that she didn't feel, smoothing her expensive dress and adjusting her posture to appear adequately distressed, yet still elegant, because even in a crisis, appearances mattered. Her hands were strategically placed over her stomach, as if she were feeling nauseous with worry, and she even managed to make her eyes tear up slightly by thinking about how late she was for her appointments. Other family members in the room observed the sudden transformation with skepticism, but Alicia was completely immersed in her role now. It must be about Alba, she thought as she adjusted her posture to appear appropriately distressed, mentally preparing herself to react appropriately to whatever news might come. The doctor continued approaching with slow, measured steps, as if each movement cost a tremendous effort after hours of intense work trying to save lives. Alicia noticed the deep circles under his eyes, the worry lines marked on his forehead, and for a brief moment she felt something close to genuine apprehension, not for Alba, but for what that somber expression might mean for her comfortable life. If Alba died, there would be a funeral to organize, an event that would require weeks of preparation and force her to play the role of grieving daughter-in-law before all of society. On the other hand, if Alba survived but became completely dependent, it would be even worse, years of care and attention that would drain time and resources she preferred to spend on herself. The doctor was now just a few steps away, and Alicia forced a few tears to run down her face, a skill she had perfected over the years to manipulate Ricardo during arguments. She took a step forward, her legs supposedly trembling, though the trembling was more from impatience than emotion. "Doctor, please tell me she's okay," she said, with a choked voice she had mentally rehearsed in the last few minutes. The approaching doctor was a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering over the years. His white coat was stained with evidence of the intensive work he had performed, and his hunched shoulders revealed the weight of having to repeatedly deliver bad news. Alicia walked toward him, her hands interlaced in front of her body in a pose she had seen in movies, trying to appear as the perfect daughter-in-law anxiously awaiting news. The doctor stopped before her, his eyes studying her for a moment as if he could see through her performance, before taking a deep breath to gather the right words. The expression on his face was somber, and even Alicia, in all her indifference, felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized the news would be serious. He hesitated for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully, while Alicia kept her mask of concern in place, although inside she was more worried about the practical implications of what she was about to hear. The doctor finally opened his mouth to speak, his deep and measured voice cutting through the ambient noise of the waiting room. "Mom, about your mother-in-law," he began, and Alicia prepared herself to hear what she secretly hoped would be the end of her problems. "Mom, your mother-in-law is in critical condition. The tests revealed a massive cerebral clot that is blocking blood flow to a significant area of the brain. Every minute that passes increases the risk of permanent damage or death. We need to operate immediately, but I must be completely honest about the risks. There is a very real chance that she may not survive the surgery," said the doctor, his hands still marked by surgical glove powder, trembling slightly from exhaustion. Alicia maintained her studied expression of concern, hands interlaced on the lap of her expensive dress, while inside she calculated how long all this would take and if she could still reschedule her salon appointment for the next day. Around them, nurses hurried past carrying medical charts. Families waited in tense silence for news of their loved ones, and the constant sound of ringing phones created a modern symphony of hospital anxiety. The waiting room seemed to have suddenly become smaller, the beige walls closing in as the weight of the doctor's words hung in the air. Alicia forced some tears to accumulate in her eyes. "Not survive? Are you saying she could die on the operating table?" she asked with false distress. "It's a real possibility, Ma'am. The procedure will take at least 8 hours, maybe more. During that time, anything can happen. Her brain is already compromised from the time it has been without adequate oxygen. We may have bleeding. Her pressure could drop drastically. Her heart might not withstand the stress of surgery. "I need you to understand the gravity before signing the consent forms," the doctor explained while picking up a clipboard with the forms. Alicia looked at the documents with feigned apprehension, her eyes quickly scanning the words that mentioned all possible risks. In reality, she was more concerned about the fact that Ricardo would know she had made the decision alone, which could generate endless discussions about responsibility and blame. On the other hand, if Alba died while they waited for his arrival, it would be even worse for her carefully cultivated image of the dedicated daughter-in-law in her social circle. The doctor waited with obvious urgency in his eyes, the clock on the wall mercilessly marking each second that could make the difference between life and death. With a dramatic sigh, Alicia took the pen and signed her name in elaborate calligraphy. "Do whatever is necessary to save her, doctor. She is very important to our family," she blatantly lied. The doctor rushed back to the surgical center, leaving Alicia alone in the waiting room with her wasted performance. She returned to her uncomfortable chair and immediately picked up her cell phone, typing a carefully crafted message to Ricardo about a minor illness of Alba's, completely minimizing the severity of the situation. Meanwhile, in the surgical center, the medical team worked frantically to prepare Alba for the battle of her life. The room was illuminated by powerful lights that left no shadows, revealing every detail of Alba's pale face as the anesthesiologists carefully administered the medications that would keep her unconscious during the crucial hours ahead. The lead surgeon methodically washed his hands, each movement practiced thousands of times throughout his career, but the tension in his shoulders revealed that he knew this would be one of the most challenging cases he had ever faced. Nurses prepared instruments on sterilized trays, the metal gleaming under the lights as they checked and rechecked each necessary item. "Let's begin. Everyone knows this will be a marathon, not a sprint. We need total focus," the surgeon told his team. "Scalpel," requested the surgeon, and a nurse immediately placed the instrument in his gloved hand. The first cut was made with millimetric precision, years of experience guiding each movement as he navigated the complexity of the procedure. The monitors around the operating table displayed Alba's vital signs in real time, each beep and undulating line telling the story of a body fighting to survive. Blood pressure oscillated dangerously, causing the anesthesiologist to constantly adjust medications to keep her stable. 2 hours passed in this delicate dance between life and death, the surgeon's hands moving with precision while trying to reach the clot without causing additional damage to the already compromised brain tissue. Suddenly, one of the monitors started beeping frantically. Alba's pressure had dropped dramatically, her heart struggling. "We need more bags here, quickly!" shouted the surgeon, while working to control what was causing the sudden drop. "Pressure continues to fall, we're losing her," exclaimed the anesthesiologist, while administering emergency medications to try to stabilize Alba. The operating room transformed into a controlled whirlwind of activity, each team member performing their role with trained precision as they fought against time. The surgeon worked even faster, his hands moving with renewed urgency as he tried to locate and correct the problem before it was too late. Minutes seemed like hours as the team struggled to keep Alba alive, the sound of monitors creating a chaotic symphony of alarms and warnings. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they managed to stabilize the pressure, but the surgeon knew this was just the first of many obstacles they would face. He paused for a moment to take a deep breath, sweat running down his forehead despite the icy air conditioning in the room. One of the younger residents suggested stopping the procedure, arguing that the risk was too high. "If we stop now, she dies for certain. We continue," declared the surgeon with determination. While the medical team fought for Alba's life, Alicia was in the waiting room responding to messages about a charity event, completely oblivious to the life and death drama happening just a few meters away. It was at this moment that Ricardo burst through the door, his suit wrinkled and his face red from having run from the airport. His blue eyes frantically searched for Alicia, who quickly put away her phone and assumed an appropriate expression of anguish. Ricardo practically ran to her, grabbing her shoulders with enough force to leave marks, his eyes wild with concern and fear. Alicia had to fight not to complain about the grip, keeping her mask of concerned wife firmly in place, as Ricardo bombarded her with questions about what had happened. She recited her carefully edited version of events, each lie flowing smoothly from her red-painted lips. "Ricardo, darling, it was all so fast. She was fine at dinner, talking normally, and then suddenly, I did everything I could, called the ambulance immediately," she said with a choked voice. "How long has she been in surgery? Why didn't you call me sooner? How did this happen so suddenly?" Ricardo fired, his questions coming faster than Alicia could answer with her elaborate lies. The tension between them was palpable, years of cold marriage condensed in this moment of crisis. Ricardo knew his wife well enough to know when she was hiding something, but his concern for Alba outweighed his need to confront Alicia at that moment. He moved away from her and began pacing back and forth, his hands repeatedly running through his hair in a nervous gesture that Alicia found irritating. The wait was torturous for Ricardo, each second without news increasing his anxiety to unbearable levels. Alicia watched her husband with a mixture of boredom and irritation, wishing he would calm down so she could go back to checking her phone without appearing insensitive. 3 hours. "She's been in there for 3 hours and still no news," he muttered more to himself. In the operating room, the situation was becoming increasingly critical. The surgeon had finally reached the clot, but it was larger and more complex than the scans had shown, extending across an area of the brain that controlled vital functions. Removing the clot without causing catastrophic damage would be like defusing a bomb with trembling hands. Every movement had to be calculated, every cut precise to the millimeter. Any error could result in instant death or damage that would leave Alba in a permanent vegetative state. The team worked in tense silence, communicating only with glances and minimal gestures, all aware that they were walking the fine line between saving and destroying a life. The anesthesiologist constantly monitored vital signs, making micro-adjustments to keep Alba stable, while her body underwent the extreme trauma of surgery. "Be careful with that area, there's a lot of potential bleeding there," warned the assistant surgeon. "I see it. Let's go slow here. Nurse, more gauze." "We need total visibility," responded the lead surgeon, his hands absolutely steady despite the extreme pressure. Another hour passed in this delicate dance, the clot being removed fragment by fragment, each piece representing a small triumph in the battle for Alba's life. Suddenly, when they were almost finished removing the clot, a blood vessel ruptured, causing a hemorrhage that quickly began to flood the surgical field. Controlled panic took over the room as multiple hands worked to contain the bleeding, compresses being applied and removed in rapid succession. The heart monitor began to show dangerous arrhythmias, Alba's heart struggling against the massive stress to which it was being subjected. "We need to control this now, or we're going to lose her," shouted the surgeon. 3 more hours passed in slow agony, Ricardo unable to stay still, alternating between sitting, standing, walking the corridors, and returning to the waiting room. Alicia had completely given up pretending constant concern, now openly browsing on her cell phone, while Ricardo was too distracted by his own anguish to notice or care. The hospital continued its frantic pace around them, other families receiving their own devastating or miraculous news, the endless cycle of life and death that defined that place. Ricardo thought about all the moments he had wasted, all the lost opportunities to spend time with his mother, the unreturned calls, the cancelled lunches, always assuming there would be more time. The guilt was suffocating, mixed with the paralyzing fear that perhaps there would not be a second chance. "Please, God, if you exist, give me one more chance to be a better son," he whispered in a desperate prayer. In the operating room, after hours of intense struggle, the team had finally managed to control the hemorrhage and completely remove the clot. The surgeon stepped back, exhausted but cautiously optimistic, watching as they began the delicate process of closing, each suture needing to be perfect to avoid future complications. Alba had survived so far, but her body was at the absolute limit, each organ struggling to continue functioning after the massive trauma. The anesthesiologist began the slow process of adjusting the medications, preparing her to be transferred to the intensive care unit, where the true battle for recovery would begin. 10 hours had passed since the beginning of the surgery, 10 hours that tested the limits of the entire medical team. "We did it. Now it's up to her and God," said the surgeon, removing the soiled gloves. "Prepare the ICU. She's going to need constant monitoring. The next 48 hours are critical. Any change, any sign of trouble, call me immediately, instructed the lead surgeon to the nursing team. Alba's transfer to the ICU was done with extreme care, her fragile body connected to multiple machines that now maintained her vital functions. The mechanical ventilator rose and fell rhythmically, breathing for her while her brain struggled to recover from the trauma. Monitors showed each heartbeat, each assisted breath, each fluctuation in her blood pressure. The head nurse checked all the connections once more, ensuring that nothing could go wrong during this crucial period. Meanwhile, the doctor walked slowly toward the waiting room, exhausted after the surgical marathon. "Mr. Montero, the surgery is over. Your mother survived," he announced as he entered. Ricardo almost collapsed with relief upon hearing the words, tears flowing freely down his face as he repeatedly thanked the doctor and God and any higher power that had heard his prayers. Alicia made an expression of relief that didn't reach her eyes, more concerned with the fact that now she would have to continue the role of dedicated daughter-in-law for longer. The doctor quickly tempered the relief with reality, explaining that Alba was in an induced coma and that the next 48 hours would be absolutely crucial in determining whether she would recover or not. Ricardo absorbed every word, determined to fully understand the situation and what he could expect. The doctor led them to the ICU, warning them about Alba's appearance and the amount of equipment around her. "She looks fragile, but the fact that she survived the surgery shows she's a fighter," he said encouragingly. The sight of Alba in the ICU was a shock even with the doctor's warning. She looked so small and fragile in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that constantly beeped and hummed, tubes and wires connecting her to a world of medical technology that kept her alive. Ricardo approached slowly, gently taking his mother's hand, feeling how cold it was, how different from the warm hand that had comforted him throughout his childhood. Alicia remained at the door, clearly uncomfortable with the scene, checking her watch and audibly sighing. Ricardo completely ignored his wife, all his attention focused on his mother, whispering words of love and encouragement, promising to be there when she woke up. The hours passed slowly, Ricardo refusing to leave Alba's side even when the nurses suggested he should rest. "I won't leave her alone again. Never again," he firmly declared. Alicia had gone out for fresh air hours ago, actually going to the hospital cafeteria to eat something decent and make calls to her friends, inventing dramatic stories about her heroic role in saving Alba's life. Meanwhile, Ricardo kept vigil, observing every movement on the monitor, every change in the numbers he had learned to interpret in the last few hours. It was during the early morning of the second day that the first alarm sounded. The heart monitor began showing irregularities, Alba's heart beating erratically before suddenly starting to dangerously slow down. Nurses rushed into the room with the doctor right behind them, while Ricardo was gently but firmly pushed outside. Through the glass window, he could see the medical team working frantically over his mother, chest compressions being administered while medications were injected into her intravenous lines. "No, no, no, please, Mum, hang on," Ricardo shouted, punching the wall in despair. "We managed to bring her back, but it was close. Her heart is very weak after all the stress. We need to be prepared for this to happen again," the doctor explained after stabilizing Alba. Ricardo had barely processed these words when, just 2 hours later, the alarm sounded again. This time, the cardiac arrest was more severe, the monitor showing the dreaded flat line that meant Alba's heart had completely stopped. The medical team worked with desperate urgency, alternating chest compressions, administering adrenaline, using the defibrillator repeatedly. Minutes passed like hours, 5 minutes, then 10, the time limit where irreversible brain damage begins to occur. Ricardo watched in horror through the glass. Alicia had come running when she heard the commotion, but kept her distance, more concerned with not getting in the way than genuinely distressed. "How much longer are we going to continue?" asked a young nurse. "We continue until I say stop," replied the lead doctor, refusing to give up while doing another round of chest compressions, his entire body working to force Alba's heart to beat again. Sweat ran down his face as he counted aloud each compression, maintaining the precise rhythm needed to have any chance of success, his arms beginning to shake from the continuous effort, but his determination unwavering. The nurse beside him continued administering breaths through the oxygen bag, inflating Alba's lungs in perfect synchrony with the compressions, a macabre dance between life and death that everyone in the room knew all too well. Another doctor prepared another dose of adrenaline, the third in the last few minutes, hoping that this time the heart would respond to the chemical stimulus and start beating on its own. 15 minutes had passed since Alba's heart had stopped. 15 minutes of tireless effort, of desperate attempts, of refusal to accept what seemed increasingly inevitable. The heart monitor continued showing the cruel flat line. No undulation, no sign that the heart was responding, just the electronic emptiness of death. "Doctor, it's been 15 minutes. The protocol suggests," a younger nurse began to say, but was silenced by a look from the lead doctor. "I know the protocol. One more round of adrenaline. Prepare the defibrillator again," he ordered, even knowing that the chances were practically nil after so much time. The team obeyed without questioning, each performing their role even though hope was rapidly fading, professionalism overcoming the statistical reality that after 15 minutes of cardiac arrest, the chances of recovery without massive brain damage were almost non-existent. The defibrillator was charged once more, the paddles positioned on Alba's chest, now marked with evidence of multiple previous attempts, the skin reddened by the repeated trauma of electrical discharges. The doctor momentarily stepped back as the discharge was administered, Alba's body arching slightly with the electrical impact, but the monitor stubbornly continued showing the straight line that meant absence of cardiac activity. More compressions were initiated, the doctor alternating with another colleague when his arms began to weaken, neither wanting to be the one who gave up, who declared defeat. "Come on, Alba, come back to us." "Your son is waiting, don't give up now," muttered the doctor as he continued compressions. 18 minutes had now passed, and reality began to impose itself like a crushing weight on everyone in the room. The team's movements began to slow, becoming less urgent, the silent acceptance that they had gone beyond the point where modern medicine could make a difference beginning to settle in. The lead doctor continued for 2 more full minutes, his arms now visibly shaking from the effort, sweat soaking his lab coat, but his physician's heart refusing to be the one to make the final decision. 20 minutes since the cardiac arrest, the absolute limit of any reasonable medical protocol, the point where continuing would be more about the inability to accept defeat than about any real hope of recovery. One by one, team members began to reduce their efforts, hands that once moved with urgency, now hesitant, waiting for the final word they all knew was coming. The nurse administering oxygen stopped pumping the bag, her eyes meeting the doctor's in a silent question that he answered with an almost imperceptible nod. I think we've done everything we could," the doctor finally said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and defeat. The head nurse began turning off the alarms one by one, each silenced beep making the room quieter, more final, until only the sound of the exhausted medical team's heavy breathing remained. The silence that followed was dense and oppressive, filled with the weight of failure, of the life they couldn't save despite all their efforts, all their training, all their dedication. The lead doctor stepped back from the bed, his legs almost giving way after standing performing compressions for so long, his lab coat soaked with sweat as if he had run a marathon. He looked at Alba, her face now completely pale, her lips with a bluish tinge indicating the prolonged absence of oxygen, and felt the familiar but never easy weight of losing a patient. The team began silently putting away equipment, storing the defibrillator, collecting the empty medication syringes that hadn't worked, each movement mechanical and practiced, the routine of death that was an inevitable part of working in intensive care. "Someone needs to inform the family," a nurse said quietly. The doctor wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his fingers still trembling slightly from the extreme physical effort of the last 20 minutes. He took several deep breaths, trying to compose himself before having to deliver the news that no doctor wants to give, that no family wants to hear, the words that would change Ricardo's life forever. Through the ICU glass, he could see Ricardo pressed against the window, his eyes red and swollen from crying, his mouth forming silent words of pleading, as if his prayers could somehow reverse what had happened. Alicia was a few steps behind, checking something on her cell phone, occasionally looking up with an expression of poorly disguised boredom, clearly more bothered by the inconvenience than by the tragedy unfolding. The doctor looked at the clock on the wall one more time, noting the hands marking 3:47 in the morning, the exact moment that would be officially recorded, the moment when Alba Montero ceased to exist according to all medical parameters. "Prepare the documentation. I'll speak to the family," he told the head nurse. The head nurse picked up the clipboard where she would officially record the time of death, her pen hovering over the paper as she waited for the doctor to say the final words that would make everything official, definitive, irreversible. The doctor adjusted his lab coat, trying to look more presentable despite his evident exhaustion, mentally preparing himself to face Ricardo and deliver the news that would destroy his world. He took one last look at Alba, allowing himself a moment of mourning for the life he couldn't save, for the family that would now have to learn to live with the loss, for the son who would never hug his mother again. The other team members began silently leaving the room, each dealing with the failure in their own way, some already mentally preparing for the next patient, others carrying the weight of this loss for days. The doctor walked slowly toward the door, each step seeming to require a monumental effort, not just from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of what he was about to do. "Time of death," he began to say, turning to the nurse who would officially record it. "Time of death 3:40 and..." The doctor began to pronounce the fateful words when a weak sound, almost imperceptible, cut through the deadly silence of the room. It was a solitary beep coming from the only monitor still connected to Alba, a sound so faint that initially everyone thought it was collective imagination born of desperation. The head nurse froze with her pen still suspended over the paper, her eyes widening as she stared at the monitor that had remained flatlined for an endless 20 minutes. Another beep sounded, then another, irregular and weak but undeniably present, Alba's heart fighting to come back to life against all medical probabilities. The doctor spun around so quickly he almost lost his balance, his eyes fixed on the monitor, where a trembling line was beginning to form, not the strong and regular rhythm of a healthy heart, but the desperate effort of an organ refusing to surrender. The room that seconds before was immersed in the resignation of death exploded into frantic activity again. "My God, she's coming back! Quick, we need to stabilize her now!" shouted the doctor with a voice hoarse with emotion. "Adrenaline, now! I want the respirator at maximum. All monitors connected immediately," commanded the doctor, while his hands worked frantically over Alba, checking carotid pulse, administering medications directly into the vein, adjusting the IV drip to compensate for the extremely low pressure. Ricardo had fallen to his knees on the other side of the glass, his hands pressed against the window, as he sobbed with relief at seeing the frantic movement that meant his mother was still alive. There was still hope. Alicia had taken several steps back, her face pale not from concern but from genuine surprise, as if she couldn't process that Alba had survived when everyone had prepared for her death. The head nurse deliberately tore up the paper where she had begun to note the time of death, throwing the pieces into the trash with a smile of relief as she picked up new forms. For the next 4 hours, the team worked non-stop to stabilize Alba, each heartbeat being monitored, each breath carefully assisted by the mechanical ventilator. "It's impossible, but she's here. 20 minutes of cardiac arrest. She shouldn't have come back," murmured a resident in admiration. The next weeks passed in a blur of medical procedures, endless vigils, and small progressions that seemed monumental given the circumstances. Alba remained in an induced coma for days, her brain needing time to recover from the massive trauma it had suffered. When they finally gradually reduced the sedatives, and she opened her eyes for the first time, Ricardo was by her side, as he had been every day, holding her hand and talking about childhood memories. The moment their eyes met was one of pure recognition, mother and son connected despite all the limitations that now separated them. Alba tried to speak, but no coherent sound came out, only a hoarse moan that made her cry in frustration. The doctors explained that the aphasia was severe. She understood everything but couldn't form words, in addition to the partial paralysis on her right side that left her practically immobile. Ricardo immediately began to look for the best possible care, determined to give his mother every chance at recovery. "I'll find the best nurse in the country, Mum. You're going to get better, I promise," he whispered, as he kissed her forehead. That's how Martina arrived at the Montero mansion on a clear Monday morning, 3 weeks after Alba's stroke. She got out of the modest taxi, carrying only a simple suitcase and a bag with her work instruments, her brown hair tied in a practical bun and her impeccable white uniform giving her a professional yet approachable appearance. Ricardo received her personally at the door, anxious and hopeful, immediately guiding her to the room that had been prepared on the ground floor for Alba. The space that was once an elegant office had been transformed into a functional but welcoming hospital room, with the medical bed positioned to receive natural light from the large window, monitoring equipment discreetly arranged so as not to dominate the environment, and some family photos strategically placed where Alba could see them. Martina observed everything with experienced eyes, making mental notes about adjustments that would need to be made. "It's a good space, Mr. Montero. We'll make it perfect for your mother's recovery," she said, with calm confidence. Alba was awake when Martina approached for the first time, her eyes following every movement of the nurse, with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Martina pulled a chair and sat next to the bed, not above Alba but at the level of her eyes, a small but significant gesture that established equality instead of hierarchy. She gently took Alba's valid hand and introduced herself in a clear but soft voice, explaining that she was there to help her recover as much independence as possible, that they would work together as a team, and that she would always respect her limits and wishes. Alba watched her intensely, clearly processing every word, and when Martina finished speaking, she weakly squeezed her hand in response. It was the beginning of a connection that would deepen in the following days. Martina spent the first hours simply observing Alba, noticing how she responded to stimuli, what movements she could make, how her eyes followed conversations even without being able to participate verbally. "I see that you understand everything perfectly. That's excellent. We'll build our communication from that," Martina said encouragingly. The first full day of work began at 7 in the morning, with Martina quietly entering the room to find Alba already awake, looking out the window with a melancholic expression. The nurse opened the curtains completely, letting the morning sun flood the room, and began to narrate each action she would take, a habit she maintained to preserve the dignity and autonomy of her patients even when they couldn't respond. The morning hygiene was a delicate and time-consuming process. Martina needed to bathe Alba in bed, as she still didn't have the stability to be transferred to the bathroom. She warmed the water to the perfect temperature, testing it with her own wrist before starting, and covered Alba with heated towels to maintain her privacy while washing one body part at a time. Alba initially tensed at the touch, tears silently streaming down her face for being so dependent, but Martina maintained a constant flow of casual conversation about the weather, about the flowers in the garden they could see through the window, normalizing the moment. "You have beautiful skin, Mrs. Alba. We'll take good care of it to prevent bed sores," Martina commented while gently applying moisturizer. Breakfast was another challenge that Martina faced with infinite patience. Alba could only swallow thickened liquids and purees. Anything more solid caused dangerous choking due to the dysphagia caused by the stroke. Martina had prepared oatmeal porridge at the perfect consistency, neither too thin that would run from her mouth, nor too thick that would be difficult to swallow, seasoned with a touch of cinnamon to make it more appetizing. She positioned Alba at a 45-degree angle, placed a discreet bib that looked more like an elegant scarf, and began offering small spoonfuls. The first attempt resulted in Alba involuntarily spitting, the frustration evident in her eyes as the porridge ran down her chin. Martina gently cleaned without making a fuss, offering the next spoonful as if nothing had happened. It took 45 minutes for Alba to consume half a cup of porridge, but Martina celebrated it as a victory. "Excellent, Mrs. Alba. Tomorrow we'll try a little more," she encouraged. After breakfast, Martina initiated the first mobility exercises, starting with passive movements where she gently moved Alba's limbs to maintain flexibility and prevent muscle atrophy. She explained each movement as she did it, why it was important, which muscles were being worked, treating Alba as the intelligent woman she still was, despite her physical limitations. When she tried to move the paralyzed right arm, Alba moaned in pain and Martina immediately stopped, adjusting her approach to be even gentler. With the left arm that still had some movement, Martina encouraged Alba to try small gestures, raising her hand a few inches, trying to touch her own face, squeezing a soft foam ball. Each micro-movement was celebrated with genuine enthusiasm, building Alba's confidence little by little. Ricardo appeared at the door during the exercises, observing in silence so as not to interrupt. "Your mother is a warrior, Mr. Montero." "Look, she's already trying to raise her hand by herself," Martina said, making Alba blush slightly with pride. During lunch, Alicia made her first appearance in the room since Martina had arrived. She stopped at the door as if the environment was contaminated, her nose slightly wrinkling at the smell of medicines and disinfectant that permeated the space. Martina was helping Alba with a vegetable puree when Alicia entered without knocking, her high heels clicking on the wooden floor. She barely looked at Alba, addressing Martina directly with an authoritative tone that made clear who she considered to be in charge. Alba immediately tensed, refusing the spoon Martina was offering, while the elderly woman turned her face to avoid eye contact with her daughter-in-law. Alicia made a disdainful comment about the smell of the food, asking if there wasn't anything more appetizing available, completely ignoring the fact that Alba was limited to specific textures due to medical necessity. Martina maintained her professional composure, politely explaining the dietary restrictions, but Alicia had already lost interest, checking messages on her phone. "I hope she doesn't stay like this forever." "It's depressing," Alicia muttered before leaving, and Martina saw tears forming in Alba's eyes. The afternoon brought the first session of attempting alternative communication. Martina had brought cards with letters and basic symbols, hoping to establish some method for Alba to express needs and thoughts. She spread the cards on the bedside table and asked Alba to try pointing with her left hand to form simple words. The process was frustrating. Alba's coordination was compromised, and often she pointed to the wrong letter, having to start over. After half an hour, they had only managed to form the word water, but Martina celebrated as if it were a complete speech. She immediately brought fresh water with thickener for the appropriate consistency, showing Alba that her communication had been successful. The expression of accomplishment on Alba's face was the first glimpse of real hope that Martina had seen. They continued practicing until Alba became visibly exhausted, but they had established the foundations for future communication. "Tomorrow we'll try to form complete sentences. You'll see. Soon we'll be conversing," Martina promised. The end of the first day came with Martina helping Alba prepare for sleep. She repeated the hygiene process, this time including nighttime care such as adapted toothbrushing and applying cream to prevent skin dryness. Alba was more relaxed now, allowing the care without the tension of the morning. Martina adjusted the bed to a comfortable sleeping position, ensuring that Alba could see the emergency button within reach of her left hand. Before leaving, she sat down again beside the bed and took Alba's hand. She talked about the progress they had made on that first day, about the potential she saw for recovery, about how tomorrow they would try new things. Alba squeezed her hand in response, and for the first time since the stroke, something that could be interpreted as a small smile appeared on her face. "Rest well, Miss Alba. Tomorrow will be even better," Martina said softly before turning off the main light, leaving only a soft night light. In the weeks that followed, Martina established a routine that gave structure and purpose to Alba's days. Each morning began in the same comforting way, with Martina narrating the weather and the day's news while helping Alba with morning hygiene. The exercises were gradually intensified as Alba gained strength, first passive movements, then assisted, and finally some attempts at independent movements with the left side of her body. Communication through cards evolved into a blinking system, one for yes, two for no, which was faster and less frustrating. Martina documented each small progress in a notebook that she showed to Ricardo every night, her enthusiastic reports of minimal improvements giving hope to the dedicated son. Alicia continued her sporadic appearances, always brief and uncomfortable, treating Alba more like an inconvenient piece of furniture than a person. Today, she managed to hold the spoon for 3 seconds by herself. "It's a significant advancement in motor coordination," Martina reported with genuine pride. It was exactly 3 weeks after Martina began working that Alicia decided to resume her weekly teas with her club friends. It was a sunny Thursday, and Martina was in the middle of a physiotherapy session with Alba, working to strengthen the neck muscles to improve head control. Alba was particularly responsive that day, managing to keep her head up for almost a minute without support, an important milestone in her recovery. They were celebrating this progress when Alicia abruptly entered the room without knocking, as was her custom, dressed in a navy blue outfit that must have cost more than Martina earned in a month. Her face showed poorly disguised irritation at seeing Alba sweaty from the effort of the exercises, her hair slightly disheveled, wearing the comfortable cotton clothes that Martina had chosen to facilitate movement. Alicia didn't even address Alba, talking about her as if she weren't present. "My friends arrive in 20 minutes. Clean her up and dress her in something presentable." "They want to see her," she ordered coldly. Martina felt Alba immediately tense under her hands, the progress of the last hour evaporating as fear took hold of the elderly woman. Alba's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head negatively with what little movement she could manage, clearly terrified at the prospect of being displayed to Alicia's superficial friends. Martina tried to intervene diplomatically, explaining that Alba was exhausted from the exercises and that perhaps it would be better to let her rest, but Alicia cut her off with an impatient hand gesture. The daughter-in-law stepped closer, her expensive perfume invading the space, and her voice took on that dangerous tone that accepted no argument. Martina had dealt with difficult relatives before, but Alicia's pure disdain for Alba was something that deeply shocked her. Still, she knew that confronting Alicia now would only make things worse for Alba later, when they were alone. With a heavy heart, Martina agreed, but not without squeezing Alba's hand in a silent gesture of solidarity. 20 minutes, not a second more," Alicia said, before walking out with clicking heels. Preparing Alba was more difficult than ever, each movement meeting resistance born from the panic taking hold of the elderly woman. Martina began by gently removing the physical therapy clothes, noticing how Alba's hands trembled uncontrollably, not from the usual spasms, but from pure fear of what was to come. The nurse worked with infinite patience, narrating each action before doing it, asking silent permission with her eyes before each touch, respecting Alba's dignity even in this moment of extreme vulnerability. The light blue dress she chose had large front buttons, making the dressing process easier, without causing additional discomfort. But even so, it took almost 10 minutes to put it on properly, the sleeves being especially challenging with Alba's paralyzed right arm. Martina noticed how the elderly woman's body was rigid as a board, every muscle tense in anticipation of the emotional suffering she knew would come. While adjusting the dress, she maintained a constant flow of gentle conversation about mundane things. The garden they could see through the window, the birds that had visited the feeder that morning, anything to try to distract Alba from the growing anxiety. "You look beautiful in this blue. It perfectly matches your eyes. Let's just fix your hair now," Martina said gently, picking up the soft brush. Brushing Alba's grey hair was normally a relaxing moment in their routine, but today, each stroke of the brush seemed to increase the tension. Martina worked methodically, carefully untangling the knots, arranging the strands in a low bun that was elegant but not too elaborate, securing it with pins that wouldn't squeeze or cause headaches. Alba made small sounds of protest in her throat, not from physical pain but from emotional distress, and Martina stopped several times to dry the tears that were already beginning to flow even before they left the room. Makeup was even more challenging. Martina rarely used cosmetics with Alba, preferring the elderly woman's natural beauty, but she knew Alicia would complain if she looked too pale or sick. With delicate hands, she applied a light foundation to give color to her face, a touch of blush on her cheeks, and a soft pink lipstick that wouldn't be too flashy but would give life to Alba's lips. Throughout the process, she could feel Alba's racing heart through the pulse in her neck, the panic increasing with each passing minute. "I promise I won't leave your side for even a second. If it gets too difficult, blink 3 times quickly and I'll make up an excuse for us to leave," Martina whispered in Alba's ear. The transfer to the wheelchair, which normally took less than 2 minutes with Alba's cooperation, turned into an ordeal of almost 10 minutes. Alba's muscles were so rigid with anxiety that Martina had to use special relaxation techniques, gently massaging the elderly woman's shoulders, guiding her through breathing exercises, trying to calm her enough to move her safely. First, she needed to position Alba at the edge of the bed, which Alba normally helped with, by pushing herself with her left arm, but now she was paralyzed with fear. Martina had to do all the work alone, careful not to strain any muscle or cause pain. When she finally got Alba seated, she now needed to transfer her to the wheelchair positioned next to the bed. Normally, Alba could support part of her weight on her left leg, but now her legs seemed made of jelly. Martina hugged Alba firmly, whispering encouragements as she carefully lifted and turned her to the chair. Alba clung to her with her left arm with such force that it would leave marks, fear palpable in every fiber of her being. There, we made it. The hardest part is over, Martina gently lied, knowing that the worst was yet to come. After settling Alba in the chair, Martina carefully adjusted the footrests, making sure her legs were in a comfortable position, placed a small cushion behind her back for additional support, and arranged a light shawl over Alba's shoulders, both to warm her and to give her something to hold with her left hand if she needed comfort. She checked once more to ensure Alba looked presentable, dress unwrinkled, hair in place, makeup intact despite the tears she had dried. Alba looked at her with eyes that begged not to have to go through this, and Martina felt her own heart breaking. She knelt in front of the chair, taking Alba's hands in hers, and made one last solemn promise that she would not allow anyone to humiliate her beyond what was bearable. With a final reassuring squeeze, she stood up and positioned herself behind the chair. The hallway to the living room had never seemed so long, each meter a march toward the emotional scaffold awaiting Alba. Martina could feel the tension radiating from the elderly woman through the handles of the wheelchair. "Take a deep breath with me, Donna Alba. We'll go in, stay as little as necessary, and leave. It's just a quick visit," she whispered one last time. Martina took a deep breath before pushing the chair through the living room door, her stomach tight with the premonition of what was to come. The room was impeccably decorated, every detail calculated to impress, from the lush floral arrangements to the French porcelain precisely arranged with millimetric precision on the Irish linen tablecloth. The air was heavy with a mixture of expensive perfumes competing with each other, creating a suffocating atmosphere of forced opulence. As they entered the elegantly decorated room, 5 women turned simultaneously to observe them, like well-dressed vultures assessing prey. Their perfectly made-up faces and aesthetic procedures couldn't completely hide the morbid curiosity, mixed with false pity that shone in their eyes. Each wore clothes that would cost a middle-class family's annual salary, jewelry that sparkled under the crystal chandelier light, and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Martina noticed how they all made a quick assessment of Alba, their gazes running from her face to her immobile feet, cataloguing every evidence of the elderly woman's disability. "Here she is. As you can see, the situation is challenging," said Alicia with false concern, gesturing toward Alba as if presenting an exhibition piece. Martina positioned Alba's chair strategically near a side table, trying to give her some dignity by physically including her in the group without making her the center of the spectacle. Alicia's friends immediately began talking about Alba in the third person, as if she were deaf as well as mute, discussing her appearance, speculating about her chances of recovery, sharing morbid stories of other acquaintances who had suffered strokes. A woman with excessive jewelry leaned toward Alicia and commented loudly how sad it was to see someone who had been so vibrant reduced to such a state. Another praised Alicia for her sacrifice in keeping Alba at home instead of doing the sensible thing and institutionalizing her. Alba kept her eyes lowered, silent tears running down her cheeks, as she was reduced to an object of speculation and false compassion. Martina remained steadfast by her side, occasionally wiping Alba's tears with a handkerchief, her presence the only comfort in the midst of that emotional torture. "The physical therapy is showing excellent results. Donna Alba is progressing remarkably." Martina tried to intervene but was ignored. It was when a maid brought an additional tea tray that disaster struck. Alba was trying to discreetly wipe her nose with her left hand when an involuntary spasm, common in patients with her type of neurological injury, caused her arm to move abruptly to the side. The movement hit the nearest porcelain cup, sending it in a perfect arc, before shattering on the Persian rug that Alicia had purchased at an auction in Paris. The dark liquid spread across the ancient weave of the 500-year-old rug, the stain growing like a silent accusation as all the women watched in shock. The silence that followed was dense and threatening, Alicia slowly rising from her chair, her face transforming from surprise to pure fury. "You! Do you have any idea what you've just done?" she hissed, approaching Alba. "Do you have any idea what you just did? This rug is worth more than a house. 500 years of history destroyed because you can't control your pathetic movements," Alicia shouted, her face inches from Alba's spittle flying as she vociferated her anger. The friends watched in shocked silence as Alicia continued her cruel humiliation, pointing an accusatory finger at the elderly woman's face, who was trying to shrink into her wheelchair. Alba sobbed silently, tears flowing abundantly down her cheeks, while trying to form words of apology that wouldn't come out, only incomprehensible guttural sounds that seemed to infuriate Alicia even more. Martina could no longer watch such cruelty and moved decisively, positioning herself between Alicia and Alba, using her own body as a shield while gently wiping the elderly woman's tears with a handkerchief. The nurse kept her voice calm and professional, even as her heart beat furiously with indignation at the inhumane treatment. "Mrs. Alicia, it was an accident. The spasms are involuntary, Mrs." "Alba had no control over it," Martina said firmly, staying between the two women. "Don't you dare contradict me in my own house. You're just a servant. You have no right to interfere in family matters." Alicia exploded, now directing her fury at Martina. But the nurse held her position, refusing to move and leave Alba vulnerable again. Alicia's friends began to murmur among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the level of cruelty being displayed, some already standing up to leave discreetly. Martina continued protecting Alba, who was now clutching her arm with desperate force, trembling uncontrollably as more insults were hurled over her head. Alicia walked around Martina, approaching Alba from the other side, her expensive perfume mixing with the smell of spilled tea as she leaned threateningly. Her next words were calculated to cause maximum emotional pain, each syllable distilling pure venom. "Look at you, a useless person who can't even hold a cup. You've become an unbearable burden to all of us," she spat with disdain. "Enough! You have no right to speak to her like that. Mrs. Alba is a human being who deserves respect and dignity." Martina finally raised her voice, no longer able to contain her indignation at such cruelty. She wrapped Alba in a protective embrace, feeling the elderly woman's fragile body shake with silent sobs, and turned to face Alicia with iron determination in her eyes. The two women stared at each other, the tension between them electric, while Alicia's friends watched open-mouthed at the confrontation. Martina could feel Alba squeezing her hand with desperate strength, as if she were her only anchor in a sea of humiliation and pain. Alicia took a threatening step toward Martina, her voice lowering to a dangerous tone that promised retribution. It was exactly at this moment, with the two women about to confront each other and Alba crying desperately between them, that the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. "What the hell is going on here?" I could hear shouting from the garage. Ricardo's voice thundered through the room. Ricardo stopped abruptly at the entrance to the room, his eyes quickly scanning the devastating scene before him. His mother clearly in a state of extreme distress, tears streaming down her face, while Martina physically protected her from Alicia, who still had her fist raised in a threatening gesture. The tea-stained rug told its own story, but it was the expression of pure terror on his mother's face that made his blood freeze in his veins. Alicia's friends froze in their positions, like children caught doing something wrong, none of them daring to move or speak. He had cancelled his business trip after a disturbing dream about his mother the night before, something telling him he needed to return home immediately, and now he understood why. His blue eyes, normally calm and controlled, blazed with a fury that Alicia had never seen before as he processed the situation. In 3 wide steps, he crossed the room, positioning himself beside Martina and Alba, his body radiating paternal protection. "Is someone going to explain to me why my mother is being treated this way in her own home?" he demanded, his voice low but charged with contained threat. Alicia instantly changed her posture, the transformation so quick it was almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. Her face switched from fury to false concern in a matter of seconds, her hands gracefully lowering to her sides as she assumed the role of misunderstood wife and dedicated daughter-in-law. She adjusted her hair with a practiced gesture and forced tears to her eyes. a performance she had perfected over the years of marriage to manipulate Ricardo in moments of conflict. Her friends watched fascinated by the dramatic change, some knowing these tactics all too well from using them themselves in their own marriages. Alicia took a step toward Ricardo, her voice assuming a whiny and victimized tone that didn't match the fury she had displayed seconds earlier. She gestured dramatically toward Martina, trying to divert attention from her own abusive behavior. "Ricardo, darling, how good you've arrived. This insubordinate nurse has been impossible. She constantly undermines my authority in front of my friends," she proclaimed with fabricated indignation. "Insubordinate?" "Martina was defending my mother from your cruel insults. I heard every horrible word you said," Ricardo retorted, making Alicia step back, surprised that he had heard more than she thought. He knelt beside his mother's wheelchair, gently taking her trembling hand while observing her tear-stained face, her body still shaking with silent sobs. Alba clung to him with desperate strength, her eyes communicating all the suffering she had endured in recent weeks, all the humiliation and cruelty she couldn't express in words. Martina stood firm beside them, her hand still protectively on Alba's shoulder, refusing to step away even under Alicia's furious gaze. Ricardo rose slowly, kissing his mother's forehead before turning to face his wife with an expression she had never seen before. Not just anger, but something deeper, more final. Alicia's friends began to mumble excuses and collect their purses, clearly wanting to escape, before the situation escalated further. "I think we'd better go, Alicia. Clearly this isn't a good time," one of them said nervously. In a few minutes, all the visitors had hurriedly departed, leaving only the four in the room, Ricardo and Martina flanking Alba protectively, while Alicia remained isolated on the other side, her victim mask beginning to crack under her husband's penetrating scrutiny. The silence that followed was heavy and charged with years of unspoken resentments, discovered lies, and the naked reality of a marriage that had been a farce for too long. Alicia tried once more to take control of the narrative, pointing accusingly at Martina, while her voice took on that shrill tone Ricardo had learned to despise over the years. She paced back and forth like an actress on a stage, gesturing dramatically, while trying to paint herself as the victim of the situation. Her words came out in a calculated torrent, each one chosen to manipulate and distort reality. "This woman has undermined my authority since she arrived. She disrespects me, questions my decisions, and now had the audacity to confront me in front of my friends. Either she leaves now, or I leave this house." Alicia ultimated, confident that Ricardo would choose the marriage. Martina maintained her dignity under the verbal attack, her hands gently massaging Alba's tense shoulders, while the elderly woman continued to tremble with emotion. She didn't need to defend herself because her actions spoke for themselves. The dedicated care, the infinite patience, the genuine love she showed Alba every day. When Ricardo asked for her version of events, Martina spoke with calm and professional precision, reporting not just the day's incident, but the weeks of small progress she had witnessed and facilitated. She described how Alba had regained movement in her left arm, how she was beginning to better control her head, how her eyes sparkled when she managed to complete a difficult exercise. Martina also, with care but honesty, reported Alicia's moments of impatience, the rare and brief visits, the cruel comments made when she thought no one was listening. Each word was true and said without malice, just facts presented with professional clarity. "Mrs. Alba has potential for significant recovery, Mr. Montero, but she needs an environment of love and support, not hostility and humiliation," Martina concluded with a firm voice. "You dare suggest that I don't properly care for my mother-in-law? I sacrificed my social life, my routine, everything for her," Alicia protested, but her voice had lost conviction because Ricardo knew her too well to believe her lies. He observed his mother as Martina spoke, seeing how Alba calmed down with the nurse's gentle voice, how her body relaxed under the careful touch, the stark contrast with the tension she displayed whenever Alicia approached. That's when something extraordinary happened. Alba began making a tremendous effort to lift her paralyzed right hand, her face contorting with effort as she struggled against her body's limitations. Everyone in the room watched in stunned silence as, millimeter by millimeter, the hand that hadn't moved for weeks began to rise. Sweat beaded on Alba's forehead from the monumental effort, but she persisted, her eyes fixed on Martina with iron determination. After what seemed like an eternity, she managed to move her hand just a few centimeters, but it was enough to reach out and touch Martina's arm. "My God, Mother, you're moving your right arm," Ricardo exclaimed with tears in his eyes. Alba's gesture was unequivocal. She was choosing Martina, showing everyone in the room who she felt safe with, who she wanted by her side. Martina gently held Alba's partially paralyzed hand, tears of emotion streaming down her own face as she witnessed this moment of determination and courage. Ricardo observed the bond between his mother and Martina, the trust and affection evident in every interaction, and something fundamental changed within him. Years of doubts about his marriage, of pretending not to see Alicia's coldness, of making excuses for her behavior, all crystallized in this moment of absolute clarity. He turned to Alicia, his decision made, his voice calm but final when he spoke. The woman who had been his wife for 10 years suddenly seemed like a stranger, someone he had allowed into his life but who never really belonged. "Alicia, I want a divorce. You have 1 hour to pack your things and leave this house," he announced with unwavering firmness. "You can't be serious. Because of a stained rug and this maid's lies?" Alicia screamed, her mask finally falling completely to reveal the calculating and cruel woman beneath. She advanced toward Ricardo, trying to grab his arm, but he moved away with an expression of disgust that made her stop. The reality of losing her luxurious lifestyle, social status, endless money, everything was crumbling around her, and panic took over. She tried to appeal, threaten, cry, going through the entire range of emotional manipulations that had worked successfully in the past, but Ricardo remained unmoved. He had already called his lawyer and the building security, ensuring that Alicia would be escorted out without causing further damage. Meanwhile, Martina remained by Alba's side, whispering words of comfort as the elderly woman watched her family's implosion with mixed emotions. "You'll regret this, Ricardo. I'll take half of everything you have." Alicia threatened as she was escorted out. "Martina, from today on you are no longer just my mother's nurse. You are part of this family, with a tripled salary and full authority over her care. More importantly, you have my eternal gratitude for protecting and caring for her when I failed to do so," Ricardo said, his voice choked with emotion as he held Martina's hand in gratitude. Martina was momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances, but it was Alba who stole the moment. With superhuman effort, the elderly woman, who had produced nothing but incoherent sounds since the stroke, opened her mouth and struggled to form a word. Her face turned red with the effort, vocal cords struggling to remember how they worked, tongue trying to find the right position. Martina and Ricardo watched in absolute suspense as Alba struggled, refusing to give up. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a sound emerged, weak, hoarse, but unmistakably intentional. "Na," Alba managed to articulate, her first word in weeks. Ricardo fell to his knees beside his mother's chair, sobbing openly as he held her hand, the impact of the moment being too much to contain. Martina was also crying, gently embracing Alba while congratulating her on the extraordinary feat, knowing this was just the beginning of a recovery that now had a real chance of success. Alba, exhausted but triumphant, managed something approaching a smile, her eyes shining with a light that had been absent for so long. The room that minutes before had been a stage for cruelty and humiliation now overflowed with genuine love and hope. The three remained like this for long moments, a family not of blood but of choice, united by adversity and strengthened by love. From outside they could hear Alicia shouting obscenities as she was put in a taxi, but inside the house a new peace began to settle. "Let's start again, Mother. Martina and I will take care of you, and you will get better. I promise," Ricardo whispered, kissing Alba's forehead. Martina immediately began planning aloud the new therapy regimen they would implement, now without the constant stress of Alicia's hostile presence. She talked about speech exercises they could try, about specialized physiotherapists they could bring in, about creating an environment where Alba would feel safe enough to take risks and try new things. Alba listened attentively, her left hand squeezing Martina's periodically in agreement, her eyes shining with renewed determination. Ricardo watched the two most important women in his life planning the future, and for the first time in years, felt that he was exactly where he should be. The stain on the Persian rug remained as a reminder of the moment when everything changed, but no one cared about it anymore. There were infinitely more valuable things in that room than any material object. Tomorrow we start intensive speech exercises. If you manage to say my name today, soon we'll be having complete conversations, Martina said with contagious confidence. The days that followed were transformative for everyone involved. Without Alicia's toxic presence, the house became a sanctuary of healing and recovery. Martina moved to a room closer to Alba's, available 24 hours a day, but now with a support team that Ricardo had hired to ensure that she also had adequate rest. Alba flourished under the constant and loving care, each day bringing small miracles. One more word recovered, one more movement conquered, one more genuine smile. Ricardo completely reorganized his professional life, working from home most days, to participate in therapy sessions and share meals with his mother. Afternoons were filled with speech exercises, where the three sat together, Martina patiently guiding Alba through vocal exercises while Ricardo encouraged her. It was difficult and frustrating, but the atmosphere of love and acceptance made each small progress a celebration. Do, Alba managed to say a week later, and her son cried like a baby upon hearing his name. Martina implemented a holistic rehabilitation program that went beyond physical and speech exercises. She brought music that Alba loved, discovering that the elderly woman could hum melodies even when words wouldn't come. She organized visits from old friends whom Alicia had driven away, people who genuinely cared about Alba and whose presence motivated her to try harder. The garden that Alba had always loved became her outdoor gym, where they did mobility exercises surrounded by flowers and birds. Martina documented every progress in a diary that she shared with Ricardo every night, both amazed by Alba's resilience and determination. 6 months later, Alba could form short sentences, walk short distances with the help of a walker, and most importantly, she genuinely smiled every day. The woman who had almost died that terrible night in the hospital had not only survived, but was truly living again. "Thank you for everything," Alba said clearly one day, holding Martina's and Ricardo's hands. Ricardo and Alicia's divorce became one of the most talked about cases in the courts, not for the amount involved, but for the shocking revelations that emerged during the process. Ricardo's lawyer had hired private investigators who discovered years of systematic financial diversions. Alicia had diverted money from joint accounts to secret accounts in tax havens, preparing to leave Ricardo as soon as Alba died, and she could claim a larger part of the inheritance. The recordings revealed attitudes of negligence and lack of care from Alicia towards Alba, proving her abusive behavior. Most shocking was the discovery of messages between Alicia and a lover, discussing how Alba's stroke had been convenient and speculating how long she would take to die. This evidence not only drastically reduced the divorce settlement, but also resulted in criminal charges of elder abuse, qualified negligence, and attempted fraud. During the trial, the prosecutor presented evidence that Alicia had searched online for how long elderly people survive after severe stroke and how to accelerate deterioration in stroke patients. She will receive only the minimum required by law and will be lucky if she doesn't spend years in prison, the lawyer informed Ricardo with professional satisfaction. Alicia tried to fight the accusations, hiring the most expensive lawyers she could find with the little money she still had access to, but the evidence was overwhelming, and her former friends from the club quickly distanced themselves from her, not wanting to be associated with the scandal that dominated the gossip pages. During the trial, several former household employees testified about the mistreatment they had witnessed over the years, many crying as they recalled how they were forced to ignore Alba's suffering under threat of dismissal without references. A former cook reported how Alicia would order elaborate meals prepared for her dinners, while commanding only thin soups be served to Alba, saying that old people don't need much food. The prosecutor presented a devastating case, showing a pattern of psychological, physical, and financial abuse that had extended for years, with evidence that Alicia had forged Alba's signatures on documents long before the stroke. The sentence was exemplary. Alicia was condemned to 2 years of house arrest, 5 years of mandatory community service in nursing homes, and had to pay a substantial fine that consumed any money she had managed to hide. Her secret account was frozen, and the funds returned to Ricardo, who immediately placed them in a fund to cover all of Alba's future medical care. "Justice sometimes takes time, but it always arrives," Martina commented while reading about the sentence in the newspaper. Alicia's social downfall was spectacular and complete. The society she so valued totally rejected her. Her name was removed from all important guest lists. Her membership to exclusive clubs was revoked with the justification of conduct incompatible with the institution's values, and she became persona non grata. At all social events, she had previously dominated with her arrogant presence. The same women who once envied her jewelry and designer clothes now crossed the street to avoid her, whispering among themselves about her disgrace with a mixture of shock and malicious satisfaction. Designer stores where she was once a VIP client now barred her at the entrance, her credit cards cancelled and her name blacklisted. The hairdresser she had frequented for years refused to serve her, saying he couldn't have his salon associated with someone convicted of elder abuse. Even the personal trainer and esthetician she regularly employed cancelled their services, not wanting the stain on their reputations. Alicia discovered in the hardest way that the social status she had valued above all was as fragile as the Persian rug that had been the catalyst for her downfall. "She built her life on appearances, and now nothing is left," commented one of her former friends without a hint of compassion. After serving her house arrest in a small rented apartment in the suburbs, without luxuries, and constantly monitored by an electronic ankle bracelet, Alicia fled to Miami with the few savings she still had, hoping to start over where nobody knew her. She had sold her last valuable jewelry to finance the move, naively believing she could reinvent herself in a new city. But the world of the rich and privileged was interconnected in ways she hadn't anticipated, and soon her story caught up with her through social media and connections between elite circles. She tried to infiltrate exclusive Miami Beach events, buying a dress on sale and trying to appear prosperous, but there was always someone who recognized her name or face from online articles about the scandal. Jobs she never imagined having to look for became her only option. She tried being a salesperson in department stores, but was fired when they discovered her identity, worked briefly as a receptionist in a beauty salon until a client recognized her and made a scene. The money ran out faster than expected, the high cost of living in Miami consuming her meager savings in a few months. She was forced to move repeatedly to increasingly worse accommodations, from a small but decent studio to a room in a deteriorated boarding house, and finally to a tiny back room in a house where the ceiling leaked when it rained. "How the mighty fall," she would mutter to herself while counting coins to buy food. The supreme irony of Alicia's fate was that she ended up working exactly in the type of place she had previously despised. She got a job using a false name in a fast food restaurant, cleaning tables and bathrooms, the same tasks she once considered too degrading even for her employees. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and soft, were now rough and cracked from cheap cleaning products. Her back ached constantly from bending over to clean, a pain that reminded her of how Alba must have felt all those years being forced into uncomfortable positions. The cheap polyester uniform she was required to wear irritated her skin, accustomed only to silks and Egyptian cottons. Her co-workers, most decades younger, treated her with barely disguised disdain, especially when they discovered she didn't know how to perform basic tasks like operating the cash register or making coffee. The manager, a man young enough to be her son, constantly yelled at her for being too slow, for not cleaning properly, for not smiling enough at customers. Each humiliation was a reminder of the power she had lost, of the respect she had thrown away through greed and cruelty. "Ma'am, you forgot to clean that table again," the manager shouted, and she had to bite her tongue not to respond. In the lonely nights in her moldy room, Alicia was tormented by nightmares where Alba appeared, not angry but with pity, offering her the same compassion she had denied. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the thin mattress offering little comfort for her body, unaccustomed to such discomfort. She tried to contact old acquaintances, begging for help, but all her messages were ignored or answered with cold refusals. One ex-friend even responded saying that Alicia was reaping exactly what she had sown, that karma had finally caught up with her. Without friends, without family willing to help her, and with no prospects of improving her situation, Alicia withered in her self-imposed misery. She developed health problems due to stress and poor diet, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, arthritis in her hands from repetitive work, but had no adequate health insurance for treatment. The woman who had denied proper medical care to Alba now begged for free care in overcrowded public clinics, waiting hours to be seen by overworked doctors who barely had time to listen to her. "Please, doctor, the pain is unbearable," she would plead, receiving only basic painkillers that barely relieved her suffering. While Alicia sank deeper into her downward spiral, life at the Montero mansion flourished in extraordinary ways. Martina remained with the Montero family not out of obligation, but by choice. The bond formed in those difficult moments had transformed into something indestructible. Ricardo treated her like the sister he never had, consulting her on all important decisions related to his mother and beyond. Alba saw her as the daughter she always wanted, someone who understood her beyond words, who saw her strength even in her weakest moments. The house that had once been a stage for coldness and cruelty now resonated with laughter, conversations, and the sound of recovery. The stained Persian rug was eventually replaced, but the lesson it represented remained, that true value was not in material objects, but in human connections, unconditional love, and the courage to stand up for what is right. Martina sometimes reflected on how a moment of crisis had changed so many lives for the better, how the courage to protect someone vulnerable had created a true family. "We are family," Alba said clearly one day, embracing Martina and Ricardo, and everyone knew it was the purest truth. 6 months had passed since that transformative day, when Alicia was expelled from the Montero mansion, and the change in the house's atmosphere was so palpable that even delivery people commented on the positive energy emanating from the place. Martina was in the garden that sunny spring morning, preparing a special surprise for Alba. A small elevated therapeutic garden where the elderly woman could grow her own flowers and aromatic herbs. With the help of 2 gardeners, she had spent the previous week setting up beds at the perfect height, so Alba could work sitting in her special chair or standing with support, each detail designed to maximize independence and the pleasure of the activity. Ricardo had insisted on buying the best adapted tools, with ergonomic handles and reduced weight, to facilitate handling. Martina was planting the first lavender seedlings when she heard irregular but determined footsteps approaching along the garden's stone path. She turned to see Alba walking with her elegant cane, her face illuminated by a smile that had become increasingly frequent in recent months. "Martina, dear, what are you doing so early here in the garden?" Alba asked with curiosity, her speech still measured but completely understandable. "Good morning, Ms. Alba. I was preparing a surprise for you, but it seems you woke up earlier than expected," Martina responded with a warm smile, wiping the soil from her hands on her gardening apron. Alba approached slowly but confidently, her movements showing the strength she had regained through months of dedicated physiotherapy and daily aquatic exercises in the small therapeutic pool that Ricardo had commissioned. The elderly woman stopped in front of the raised garden beds, her eyes shining with emotion as she understood the gift she was receiving, the opportunity to create something beautiful with her own hands, to nurture new life, to have a project that was completely hers. Martina observed Alba's face transform, tears of joy beginning to form as she gently touched the soft lavender leaves. The gentle fragrance floated in the morning air, and Alba closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Years ago, before the stroke, she had maintained a magnificent garden that was her pride and joy, but Alicia had ordered everything uprooted, saying that flowers attracted insects and dirt. "My garden has returned to me, finally returned," Alba whispered emotionally, squeezing Martina's hand with surprising strength. Ricardo appeared on the veranda with a breakfast tray, having developed the habit of starting every day with a shared meal outdoors when the weather permitted. He had changed drastically in recent months. The workaholic businessman had given way to a dedicated son who found genuine joy in the simple moments of daily life. His face lit up seeing his mother's reaction to the therapeutic garden, and he quickly placed the tray on the wrought iron table before joining them. The project had been Martina's idea, but he had enthusiastically embraced it, researching the best designs and materials, consulting specialized occupational therapists to ensure that every aspect would promote Alba's ongoing recovery. He knelt beside his mother, watching her examine each plant with the fascination of a child discovering something new. The transformation in Alba was miraculous. The woman who 6 months ago could barely hold a spoon now delicately handled the plant leaves, testing the texture, checking the soil moisture. "Mom, Martina and I thought you'd like to have your own green space again. There's even a section for herbs that we can use in the kitchen," Ricardo explained with contagious enthusiasm. "You two are too wonderful." "I don't know if I deserve so much love and care," Alba responded. Her voice choked with emotion, and both Martina and Ricardo immediately enveloped her in a careful but affectionate embrace. They had become a family in the truest sense of the word, united not by obligation, but by conscious choice and genuine love. After the emotional moment, they sat down for breakfast, a meal that had become a sacred ritual in the house. Alba could now eat most solid foods, having almost completely recovered her ability to swallow, although she still needed to be careful with very dry textures. Martina had learned to prepare Alba's favorite meals with small modifications that made them safer without sacrificing flavor. That morning there were creamy scrambled eggs, toast with homemade jam that Alba could spread herself, and fruit cut into pieces that she could pick up with the adapted fork or even with her hands when she felt confident. Conversation flowed naturally, with Alba telling a story from her childhood about her grandmother's garden, the words coming more easily when she was relaxed and happy. "My grandmother used to say that plants feel our love and grow better when we talk to them," she shared, making Martina and Ricardo smile. It was during coffee that Ricardo's phone rang, and he answered with some reluctance, not wanting to interrupt the family moment. His expression changed from irritation to surprise, and then to something that Martina couldn't immediately identify. He listened for several minutes, making only occasional sounds of confirmation, his eyes alternating between Martina and his mother with an increasingly serious expression. When he finally hung up, he remained silent for a moment, clearly processing what he had heard. Alba and Martina exchanged worried glances, fearing it was bad news about some aspect of the business, or perhaps something related to Alicia trying to cause problems again. Ricardo took a deep breath before speaking, his words carefully measured. He explained that it was his lawyer with news about Alicia. She had been arrested in Miami for document forgery while trying to get a job using a false identity. And during the investigation, the police had discovered evidence of other frauds she had committed over the years, including embezzlements from Ricardo's company that hadn't been previously detected. "She's facing federal charges now. She could get up to 10 years in prison," Ricardo said in a neutral voice without satisfaction, but also without pity. Alba absorbed the information in silence, her face showing a complex mixture of emotions. There was no joy in Alicia's disgrace, but perhaps a sense of cosmic justice being fulfilled. Martina remained quiet, respecting the moment, but gently took Alba's hand in silent support. It was Alba who broke the silence, her words surprising both Ricardo and Martina with the wisdom and compassion they contained. She spoke about how anger and resentment were poisons that only hurt those who carried them, about how Alicia was already living in her own prison of bitterness and greed long before being physically incarcerated. She didn't forgive the cruelties she had suffered, but she wouldn't waste precious energy hating someone who had already self-destructed so completely. Alba's maturity and grace in that moment were inspiring, showing that her recovery had been not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. She had chosen the path of inner peace instead of revenge, of love instead of hate. "Let's focus on our happiness, not on her unhappiness. We have so much to be grateful for," Alba said firmly, closing the subject. After breakfast, Martina suggested that Alba try working a bit in the new garden, and the elderly woman accepted enthusiastically. With careful but confident movements, Alba sat on the special bench that they had positioned between the flower beds, her hands picking up the adapted tools with growing familiarity. Martina observed with professional pride and personal affection as Alba began removing small weeds, her fingers working with dexterity that would have been impossible just a few months ago. Ricardo had joined them, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt without hesitation to help, the dirt soiling his manicured hands without him caring in the slightest. The three worked in comfortable harmony, talking about which plants to add, where to position the tomatoes that Alba wanted to grow, how to create a small decorative scarecrow that would also be an art project. The sun gradually rose in the sky, warming their backs as they worked, and the sound of genuine laughter echoed through the garden. "You know, I've never been as happy in my entire life as I am now," Ricardo suddenly confessed, surprising himself with the admission. Martina was watering the newly planted plants when she noticed that Alba had stopped working and was staring fixedly at her dirt-covered hands, tears silently streaming down her face. Concerned, Martina immediately put down the watering can and approached, but Alba raised her hand to indicate she was fine. With a voice trembling with emotion, Alba explained that she was crying from joy, from gratitude, from amazement at the path her life had taken. 6 months ago, she was a prisoner in her own home, humiliated daily, reduced to an inconvenient burden, unable to do the most basic things without help. Now she was there, getting her hands dirty with soil, planting flowers, laughing with people who truly loved her. The journey had been arduous, full of frustration and pain, moments when she wanted to give up, but Martina had never allowed her to lose hope. Each small victory had been celebrated, each setback faced with renewed determination. Alba took Martina and Ricardo's hands, squeezing them with strength that demonstrated not just physical, but emotional recovery. "You have given me back my life, my dignity, my joy of living," she said clearly, without stuttering or pausing. At that moment, the head gardener of the property approached with an expression of admiration, holding an old wooden box he had found buried while preparing the ground for the expansion of the therapeutic garden. The box was dirty and partially deteriorated, but still intact enough to be opened. Alba recognized it immediately. It was a time capsule that she had buried with Ricardo when he was only 10 years old, a school project about hopes and dreams for the future. They had completely forgotten about it over the years, and finding it now seemed like a sign from the universe. With hands trembling with emotion, Alba and Ricardo opened the box together, revealing long-forgotten treasures, family photos, a letter that Ricardo had written to his future self, small toys that had been precious to him, and at the bottom, a drawing that Alba had made of how she imagined her life at 70. "Look at this, Mother. You drew yourself surrounded by flowers and family. Even back then you already knew," Ricardo exclaimed with amazement. The drawing showed a gray-haired figure in a lush garden, surrounded by smiling people, and although it was childish in its execution, it perfectly captured the essence of the moment they were living now. Alba held the yellowed paper with reverence, marveling at how life had taken so many turns to finally fulfill that simple vision of happiness. Martina observed the scene with a full heart, feeling privileged to be part of this moment, of this family she had chosen. The discovery of the time capsule led to an entire afternoon of reminiscences, with Alba telling stories from Ricardo's childhood that he had forgotten, precious moments that the stroke had not erased from her memory. They laughed at the clothes and hairstyles in the old photos, cried when reading letters from relatives who had already passed, and made plans to create a new time capsule with their current hopes for the future. Martina suggested including one of Alba's paintings, a photo of the three of them together in the garden, and perhaps some seeds from the plants they were cultivating. "In 20 years, when we open it, we'll see how much we've grown, just like these plants," Martina said wisely. The afternoon was turning into evening when an unexpected visit arrived at the mansion. It was the neurologist who had treated Alba at the hospital, accompanied by a team of medical researchers who had been studying her exceptional case of recovery. They came with an extraordinary proposal. They wanted to officially document Alba's journey, create a detailed case study that could revolutionize post-stroke rehabilitation protocols. The doctor explained that the combination of dedicated care, loving environment, and Martina's holistic approach had created results that defied everything they knew about neurological recovery in elderly patients. Alba was initially hesitant, not feeling comfortable being the center of attention, but Martina and Ricardo gently encouraged her. This was an opportunity to help thousands of other people who could benefit from the knowledge gained through her experience. After some discussion, Alba agreed, with the condition that Martina be credited as a co-author of any resulting publication. Martina is the true heroine of this story. Without her, I wouldn't be here, Alba insisted, with unwavering firmness. The researchers spent the next hours conducting cognitive and physical tests with Alba, all amazed by her capabilities. She completed complex puzzles, demonstrated her recovered range of motion, recited poetry she had memorized during rehabilitation, and even played some notes on the piano that Ricardo had recently purchased to stimulate bilateral coordination. Each test revealed not just recovery, but in some areas capabilities that exceeded what would be expected for someone of her age who had never suffered a stroke. The neurologist theorized that the trauma and subsequent recovery had somehow reset certain brain functions, creating new, more efficient neural connections. Martina meticulously shared her daily records, the progress videos she had recorded with Alba's permission, and her observations about which approaches had been most effective. The researchers were particularly interested in the emotional aspect of recovery, how the environment of love and support had created ideal conditions for neuroplasticity. This case will change how we treat stroke survivors going forward, the neurologist declared with evident admiration. After the medical team left, the three sat in the living room, exhausted but joyful from the extraordinary day. Alba was flipping through a photo album that Martina had started, documenting her recovery journey from the first days in the hospital to the present. The early photos were difficult to see. Alba, pale and motionless in the hospital bed, connected to machines, her eyes empty of hope. But as the pages turned, the transformation was evident. Small smiles appearing, the first attempts to stand, the day she managed to hold a paintbrush for the first time, the afternoon when she took her first independent steps. Martina had captured not just the medical milestones, but the moments of humanity. Alba laughing at a joke, concentrating on an exercise, hugging Ricardo after a particular achievement. The album was a visual testimony of resilience, love, and the power of dedication. We should make copies of this album for the medical study. It shows the human side of recovery, Ricardo suggested, and Alba enthusiastically agreed. It was then that Martina had an idea that would change their lives even more. She suggested they create a rehabilitation center on the property, not a cold clinical hospital, but a place where other stroke survivors could experience the same kind of holistic and loving care that had transformed Alba's life. The mansion had plenty of space. The garden could be expanded to include more therapeutic areas, and they could hire a team of professionals who shared their philosophy of care. Alba could serve as living inspiration for patients, showing what was possible with determination and proper support. Ricardo immediately embraced the idea, already visualizing how they could convert the east wing of the mansion, create art therapy studios, expand the therapeutic pool. But it was Alba's reaction that surprised them most. She not only supported the idea, but insisted on being actively involved, wanting to share her experience, give hope to others who were where she had been. I want others to know that life doesn't end with a stroke. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something better, Alba declared with conviction. The next months were a whirlwind of activity and planning. Architects specializing in accessible design were hired, state-of-the-art equipment was researched and acquired, and a carefully selected team of therapists, nurses, and doctors was assembled. Martina was appointed clinical director of the center, a position she accepted with humility and determination. Alba worked with a designer to create spaces that were both functional and welcoming, insisting that each room have a view of the garden, that natural light be maximized, that the colors be soft yet cheerful. Ricardo handled the business and legal aspects, establishing a non-profit foundation that would ensure the center could serve patients regardless of their ability to pay. The transformation of the mansion into a place of healing and hope seemed poetically appropriate. Where once cruelty and neglect had reigned, now compassion and care would flourish. This house will finally have the purpose it should have always had, Alba said, as she watched workers installing support bars and ramps. The inauguration day of the Montero Rehabilitation Center arrived on a radiant autumn morning. Alba, dressed in an elegant blue outfit she had chosen herself, stood without support to cut the ceremonial ribbon, an act that symbolized not only the opening of the center, but her own journey from total dependence to recovered independence. The speech she had prepared and practiced with Martina was long and eloquent, telling her story without bitterness, focusing on the hope and possibility of rebirth that existed even in the darkest circumstances. She spoke about Martina with tears in her eyes, about how a nurse had become family, about how professional love had transformed into genuine love. She spoke about Ricardo, about how nearly losing his mother had taught him what truly mattered in life. And surprisingly, she even mentioned Alicia, not with anger but with the observation that sometimes the cruelest people end up being unwitting catalysts for the greatest transformations. The audience, composed of medical professionals, stroke survivors and their families, and community members, listened in reverent silence. This center is living proof that from the darkest moments can be born the brightest light, Alba concluded, receiving a standing ovation. The center's first patients arrived the following week, each carrying their own stories of struggle and hope. Alba made a point of personally meeting each one, sharing her experience, showing her paintings, demonstrating exercises she had found particularly helpful. Martina supervised the clinical care with the same dedication she had shown with Alba, training her staff to see beyond the physical symptoms, to treat each patient as a complete individual with dreams, fears, and unlimited potential. Ricardo often had lunch with the patients, using his business skills to help them navigate practical issues such as insurance, home adaptations, and returning to work when possible. The therapeutic garden had been expanded to include wheelchair-accessible paths, shaded rest areas, and raised beds enough for all patients who wanted to participate in horticultural therapy. The sound of laughter and conversations filled the corridors that once echoed with silence and sadness. Each person we help recover is a victory against everything this house once represented, Martina reflected one day. One afternoon, about 8 months after the center opened, Alba was painting in the art studio when a new patient was brought in. A 60-year-old woman who had suffered a stroke similar to Alba's, leaving her without speech and with partial paralysis. The woman was clearly depressed, her eyes empty with the same hopelessness that Alba had felt in those first days. Alba put her brush aside and slowly approached the woman, sitting beside her without saying anything for several minutes. Then, with gentle gestures and carefully articulated words, she began to tell her own story. She showed photos of how she was right after the stroke, videos of her first frustrated attempts to speak, paintings she had created at different stages of her recovery. The woman began to cry, but they were tears of hope, not despair. Alba took her hand and squeezed it tightly, conveying through touch what words couldn't fully express. Martina watched from the doorway, her heart filling with pride as she saw Alba become the mentor and inspiration she was destined to be. "If I could do it, you can too. Let's make this journey together," Alba promised the woman. That night, as the mansion quieted down and the patients rested, Martina, Alba, and Ricardo sat in the garden under the stars, reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had shared. Alba was knitting, another skill she had recovered, making a scarf for the new patient. Ricardo was reviewing proposals to expand the center, dreaming of creating a national network of similar facilities. Martina simply gazed at the stars, amazed at how a moment of courage, protecting Alba from Alicia's cruelty, had led to so much good. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The comfortable silence of a true family enveloped them like an embrace. Alba paused her knitting for a moment and looked at her two companions, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She had lost the ability to speak for a while, but had gained something much more precious. People who listened to her even when she couldn't speak, who saw her worth when others saw only a burden. "You know, I used to be afraid of death. Now I'm afraid of not living enough to give back all the love I've received," Alba said softly, her voice clear and strong. Martina and Ricardo immediately protested, saying she owed nothing to anyone, that her love and presence were gifts enough. But Alba shook her head with a wise smile, explaining that giving back wasn't about obligation, but about the genuine desire to spread the light she had received. Each patient she helped at the center, every word of encouragement she offered, every painting she created to brighten the hospital rooms, was her way of honoring the miracle of her recovery. She had learned that true healing wasn't just about regaining physical functions, but about discovering renewed purpose, about transforming suffering into compassion, about using her own journey to illuminate the path for others. Martina had taught her this through example, showing every day that genuine care could work miracles. Ricardo had shown that it's never too late to change priorities, to choose love over ambition, family over fortune. You two taught me that life isn't measured in years, but in moments of true connection, Alba concluded, returning to her knitting with nimble fingers. The sound of a guitar floated through the night air. One of the patients was playing on the porch, a gentle melody that spoke of hope and renewal. Alba began to hum along, her voice still not perfect but full of emotion. Martina and Ricardo joined in, creating an imperfect but beautiful harmony that echoed through the garden. Other patients and staff began to appear, drawn by the music, and soon there was a small group gathered under the stars, sharing this moment of pure joy. It was in these moments that the true magic of the center revealed itself. It wasn't just the medical treatments or innovative therapies that healed. It was the community, the sense of belonging, the certainty that no one was alone in their struggle. Alba looked around at the faces illuminated by moonlight, some still marked by struggle, others glowing with recovery, and knew with absolute certainty that this was her purpose. "This is my masterpiece," she whispered to Martina, who squeezed her hand in understanding. When the music ended and people began to disperse to their rooms, Alba remained in the garden with Martina and Ricardo. They talked about future plans. Alba wanted to write a book about her experience, not a medical manual, but a story of hope for other patients and their families. Martina was developing a training program for caregivers that emphasized the emotional aspect of care as much as the technical. Ricardo was in negotiations to acquire a neighboring property to expand the center, including facilities for outpatients and a support program for families. Each dream seemed not only possible but probable, because they had learned that with love, dedication, and faith in each other, miracles were not exceptions but expectations. The night was growing cold, and Ricardo went to fetch blankets for the three of them, returning with hot chocolate that the cook had prepared. They sat wrapped in warmth, physically and emotionally, savoring the sweetness of the moment. "Promise that we'll always be like this, always family?" Alba asked suddenly, a rare vulnerability in her voice. "Always, Mother. Martina and I will always be here. We're family by choice, which is the strongest kind there is," Ricardo replied firmly, and Martina nodded with tears in her eyes. They toasted with their mugs of hot chocolate, to the future, to the center, to the patients yet to come, but mainly to each other. The Montero mansion, which had witnessed so much pain and cruelty, had become a beacon of hope, living proof that redemption was possible, that love could transform even the darkest places into sanctuaries of light. Alba finished her scarf that night, the last stitch made with deep satisfaction. Tomorrow she would give it to the new patient, along with the promise that she would be by her side every step of recovery. But tonight, she simply enjoyed the presence of the two people who had saved her life in every possible way. "Thank you for choosing me," she said simply, and the hug that followed said everything that words couldn't express. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.